What would you do if your son walked into his wife's funeral holding his mistress's hand? I was sitting in the third row of Basilica of St. Lawrence, staring at a mahogany casket that was supposed to hold my daughter-in-law. My son stepped inside, calm and polished, with the woman he'd been sleeping with on his arm. The church froze, but no one knew what I had planned. I stood up, pressed play, and his world collapsed. Thank you for being here and staying with this story. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments so we can connect across the world. Also, please note, this story contains some fictionalized elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental, but the message behind it is real, and I believe it's worth hearing. Let me take you back. 3 months before that funeral, 3 months before the video, 3 months before everything I thought I knew about my family turned to ash. My name is Walter Graves. I am 72 years old, and for 35 years, I served as a federal judge in the Western District of North Carolina. I've sentenced drug lords, embezzlers, racketeers, and men who thought they were untouchable. I've looked into the eyes of people who destroyed lives without blinking and told them exactly how many years they would spend behind bars. I built my career on evidence, logic, and the belief that justice, when properly served, protects the people who need it most. But none of that prepared me for what was coming. I live alone in a stone house on Sunset Mountain, just outside Asheville. It's not a mansion, but it's solid, built from river rock and mountain timber, with wide windows that look out over the Blue Ridge Valley. On clear mornings, the mist sits in the hollows like spilled milk, and the ridgeline glows amber before the sun crests the peaks. Dorothy loved those mornings. She would stand at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching the light change, and say, "Walter, God paints a new masterpiece every single day. The least we can do is show up and look." Dorothy was my wife. She died 5 years ago. Alzheimer's took her slowly, the way a river carves through stone, patient and merciless. For 3 years I watched the woman I loved disappear, piece by piece. First her words, then her memories, then her recognition of my face. I would sit beside her bed at the care facility and hold her hand, and sometimes she would squeeze back, and I would pretend she knew it was me. She died on a Tuesday morning, in March. I was holding her hand when she stopped breathing. The nurses said it was peaceful. I don't know what that word means anymore. After Dorothy, the house became a museum. Her reading chair still sat by the window in the library, a worn leather wingback with a crocheted blanket draped over the arm. Her books still lined the shelves, dog-eared and underlined, margins filled with her thoughts in that precise handwriting I could recognize from across a room. I kept the rhododendron garden she planted the year we moved in. I tended it myself, pruning and feeding, talking to the plants the way she used to, as if they could hear me. Maybe they could. Maybe she could. I developed routines the way lonely people do. Coffee at 6. The newspaper, though I barely read it. A walk through the garden, if the weather allowed. Bourbon at 8. 1 glass, never 2. Sitting in the library across from Dorothy's empty chair. Sometimes I talked to her, told her about the birds I'd seen, about the neighbor's dog that kept digging under the fence, about how the mountain laurel was blooming early this year. She never answered, of course, but the silence felt less heavy when I pretended she was listening. I had one child, a son, Nathan Graves. He is 41 years old, and for most of those years, he has been the single greatest disappointment of my life. I don't say that with anger anymore. I've moved past anger into something quieter and sadder. Resignation, maybe. Or grief for the person he could have been, but chose not to become. Nathan started lying when he was 9. Small lies at first about homework, about where he'd been after school, about the missing cash from Dorothy's purse. Then the lies grew. By high school, he was forging signatures, cheating on exams, and talking his way out of consequences with a smile so charming that even I, a man who had spent decades evaluating credibility, sometimes believed him. Dorothy begged me to be patient. He's still finding himself, she would say, smoothing his hair when he was 14, 15, 17. He's smart, Walter. He just needs time. She was right about the smart part. Nathan had a mind like a razor. He could read people the way I read legal briefs, instantly identifying weaknesses and leverage points. But he used that gift the way a burglar uses a lockpick to take what wasn't his. He enrolled in law school at my urging, dropped out after one semester, started a series of businesses that all failed, borrowed money he never repaid, burned through relationships the way a forest fire moves through dry timber, leaving nothing behind but scorched ground. 2 years ago, after I refused to co-sign a loan for what he called a guaranteed real estate opportunity, Nathan stopped calling, stopped visiting, vanished from my life as completely as if he'd never existed. Part of me was relieved. The larger part ached. I hadn't heard from Nathan in 2 years. I'd almost made peace with that silence. Then one Thursday night in June, in the middle of a thunderstorm that shook the mountains, someone knocked on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody visits Sunset Mountain at 10:30 on a Thursday night, especially not during a storm that had knocked out power twice already. I set down my bourbon and crossed the foyer. Through the sidelight glass, distorted by rain streaming down the pane, I could see 2 figures on my porch. I opened the door, and the wind shoved rain into the hallway. There, under the flickering porch light, stood my son. Nathan looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him. His jaw was sharper, his cheekbones more pronounced. His clothes were expensive, a tailored jacket and leather shoes soaked through, but they hung on him like borrowed things. His eyes hadn't changed. Quick, calculating, already scanning my face for the reaction he could work with. "Dad," he said. Just that one word. But he loaded it with everything he knew I wanted to hear. She stood half a step behind Nathan, partially shielded from the rain but still drenched. She was young, early 30s, with dark hair plastered against her face and wide brown eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion and quiet dignity. She was very, very pregnant. 8 months at least. One hand gripped Nathan's arm for balance. The other cradled the underside of her belly, fingers spread wide, as if holding something precious she was terrified of dropping. "Dad, this is Rachel, my wife." Nathan paused and arranged his face into practiced sincerity. "We got married 9 months ago. She's due in 5 weeks. She has severe asthma, and the doctor said mountain air would help. We lost our apartment, and we just need somewhere safe for her and the baby." Rachel looked up at me. She didn't say anything at first. In that look, I saw something unexpected. Not desperation, not manipulation, which is what I expected from anyone Nathan brought to my door. What I saw was dignity. Bruised, exhausted, rain-soaked dignity. The kind that comes from surviving hard things and refusing to collapse under the weight of one more. "I'm sorry to show up like this, Mr. Graves," she said softly. Her voice was steadier than it should have been. "I told Nathan we should have called first." Lightning split the sky behind her. In that flash, I saw her clearly. The dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she held her belly with fierce protectiveness, the way a mother holds something the world has already tried to take from her. Something turned over in my chest. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. "Come inside," I said. "Both of you." I gave them the guest room on the 2nd floor. I found dry towels and one of Dorothy's old robes for Rachel. It was too large, swallowing her small frame, but she pulled it around herself with a gratitude that tightened my throat. Nathan talked while I made tea. He talked the way he always did, fluently, filling the air with words designed to rearrange reality. Rachel was a pediatric nurse at Mission Hospital, before the pregnancy made work impossible. They'd married quickly, quietly. He was looking for work. He had prospects. He just needed time. He wanted to be better. For Rachel. For the baby. They were naming her Hope. Hope. The word sat in the room like a living thing. I know I don't deserve to ask, Nathan said with rehearsed humility. But I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for them. I looked at Rachel. She sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around her mug, steam rising past her face. She wasn't watching Nathan perform. She was looking at the window, at the rain streaking down glass, at the darkness beyond. There was a stillness about her that reminded me of someone. Dorothy. The morning I proposed. Standing by a window, looking out at a world she wasn't sure she belonged in, but refusing to look away. Every instinct I had, the same instincts that kept me alive through 35 years of judging criminals, told me to say no. Nathan was trouble. He had always been trouble. Whatever brought him to my door at 10:30 on a storm-lashed night was certainly worse than he was letting on. But Rachel was shivering in my dead wife's robe, 8 months pregnant, holding a mug of tea like it was the first warm thing she'd touched in weeks. And somewhere beneath her hands, a baby named Hope was waiting to enter a world that had already stacked the odds against her. I thought about the empty rooms upstairs. The silence that had lived in this house for 5 years. The chair Dorothy would never sit in again. Yes, I said, you can stay, Rachel whispered. Thank you, Walter. And something in the room shifted. The house seemed to breathe, as if it had been holding its breath for 5 years, and someone had finally given it permission to exhale. I helped Rachel upstairs. She paused on the landing, looking at our wedding photograph on the wall. Your wife was beautiful, she said quietly. She was, I agreed. In every way that matters. After I showed her the guest room, I came back downstairs. Nathan was in the hallway, his back to me, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. He didn't hear me approach. I caught a fragment before he noticed me and ended the call. Yeah, I'm in. We're at the house. Everything's on track. He turned, pocketing his phone with the smooth quickness of a man who'd been hiding things his entire life. Just updating a buddy about the move, he said, smiling. I nodded and said nothing. But something cold settled at the base of my spine. The feeling I got in my courtroom when a witness smiled too easily, when a story was too smooth, when the evidence didn't align. The next morning, I found Rachel in Dorothy's reading chair by the library window, a book open on her belly, morning light catching the mountains behind her. For the first time in 5 years, the house didn't feel empty. I was happy. I didn't know that this happiness would become the doorway to the darkest chapter of my life. Those first 2 weeks changed me in ways I didn't see coming. Rachel came downstairs each morning slowly, one hand on the banister, the other resting on her belly. She moved the way heavily pregnant women do, carefully, deliberately, as if negotiating a truce with gravity. By the time she reached the kitchen, I'd have breakfast ready. Scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, fresh fruit. Simple things. But she ate like they were extraordinary. You don't have to cook for me every morning, Walter, she said on the third day, settling into the chair across from mine. I've been cooking for one person for 5 years, I told her. It's nice to have someone who actually eats what I make, instead of just a cat that judges me from across the room. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and the sound filled the kitchen the way sunlight fills a room when you open the curtains. Light and warm and unexpected. We fell into a routine. Mornings belonged to us. Nathan slept late, sometimes until 10 or 11, then disappeared for the day, claiming job interviews, networking meetings, lunches with potential business partners. I'd learned long ago not to believe Nathan's itineraries, but his absence gave Rachel and me time together, and I found I was grateful for it. She told me about her life in pieces, the way people share difficult histories, a little at a time, testing whether the listener can hold the weight. She'd grown up in the foster system after her mother died of an overdose when Rachel was 3. Her father was unknown, a blank space on her birth certificate. She'd bounced between 7 homes by the time she aged out at 18. 2 were decent, 3 were neglectful, 2 were worse than that, and she didn't elaborate. And I didn't ask. She put herself through nursing school on scholarships and overnight shifts at a diner. Became a pediatric nurse because, she said, she wanted to make sure sick children had at least one person who looked them in the eye and told them they mattered. I never had that, she said one afternoon. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the Blue Ridge turn gold in the late light. Not once, growing up. Nobody ever looked at me and said, "You matter. You belong here." She turned to me, surprised, then her eyes filled and she looked away quickly, pressing her lips together the way people do when they're trying not to cry in front of someone they haven't known long enough to cry in front of. I drove her to her prenatal appointments at Mission Hospital. Dr. Linda Castillo, her obstetrician, was a calm, thorough woman in her mid-50s who spoke to Rachel with genuine warmth. During the ultrasound, when Hope's heartbeat filled the small examination room with its rapid, steady rhythm, Rachel gripped my hand. I hadn't planned to be there. I'd just driven her and intended to wait in the lobby, but she'd asked me to come in. Quietly, almost apologetically, and I couldn't say no. When the heartbeat came through the speaker, I cried. First time in 5 years. Not sobbing. Just tears running silently down my face while Rachel held my hand, and the sound of my granddaughter's heart filled the room like a promise. "She's strong," Dr. Castillo said, smiling at the monitor. "Good heartbeat. Good size. 5 more weeks and she'll be ready." In the evenings, after Nathan had retreated to the downstairs study with his phone and his locked door, Rachel and I would sit in the library. She'd taken to Dorothy's reading chair by the window, as if it had been waiting for her. I sat on the sofa across from her, and we'd talk. Sometimes for hours. I told her about Dorothy. About how we met at a courthouse where she was a clerk, and I was a young attorney, too nervous to tie his own tie properly. How she taught me that strength wasn't about authority or control. It was about showing up for people even when it was inconvenient. How Alzheimer's stole her slowly, and how I sat beside her bed every day for 3 years, reading her favorite books aloud, hoping some part of her could still hear me. "She sounds extraordinary," Rachel said. "She was," I replied. "She would have loved you." Rachel's hand went to her belly. "I hope I can be half the mother she was." "You'll be better," I said. "Because you know what it feels like to grow up without one." She looked at me for a long moment, and something passed between us that I can't quite name. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that 2 broken people can sometimes build something whole between them. I taught her how to work the temperamental thermostat, showed her the emergency cash in the study drawer, helped her set up a proper budget, and reviewed her student loan payments. Small things. Practical things. But each one was a thread stitching her into the fabric of this house, this life, this family she'd never had. Nathan, meanwhile, became a ghost. He left early, came home late, spent hours behind the locked study door. When he was around Rachel, he performed the role of attentive husband with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it. He'd ask how she was feeling in the same tone you'd ask about the weather. When she mentioned her asthma was acting up, he'd nod and say, "You should rest more." Then check his phone. I watched him the way I'd watched defendants for 35 years. And what I saw worried me. But it was Rachel who worried me more. By the end of the 2nd week, something had shifted. She was coughing more. Not the dry, wheezy cough of asthma I'd heard when she first arrived, but something deeper, wetter, more aggressive. She'd stop halfway up the stairs, gripping the banister with white knuckles, fighting for air. She barely finished meals. Some mornings her hands trembled around her coffee mug so badly that liquid sloshed over the rim. "It's just the asthma," she said when I asked. "It gets worse in late pregnancy. The doctor said it's normal for some women, but I'd watched Dorothy through 3 years of illness. I knew what normal decline looked like, and this wasn't it. Rachel wasn't just uncomfortable. She was deteriorating, fading, as if something inside her was being consumed, burned through, eaten alive. And deep in my gut, the instinct that had helped me see through thousands of liars and criminals over 35 years on the bench was screaming that this had nothing to do with asthma at all. I found her on the bathroom floor on a Tuesday morning. I'd gone upstairs to tell her breakfast was ready and heard a sound through the closed door, a wet, rasping cough followed by a small cry. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Then I opened the door and saw Rachel sitting on the tile with her back against the bathtub, legs folded beneath her belly, unable to get up. Her right hand was pressed against her mouth. When she pulled it away, there was blood on her palm. Not much, just a thin streak across her fingers, bright red against her pale skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered when she saw me in the doorway. I got dizzy. Everything started spinning and I just couldn't stand anymore. I knelt beside her and helped her to her feet. She weighed almost nothing. Despite the pregnancy, I could feel her ribs through her nightgown, the tremor in her muscles, the way she leaned into me like a building whose foundation was crumbling. "We need to call your doctor," I said. "Nathan says it's normal." Her voice was small, automatic. Like she was reciting something she'd been told so many times, she'd stopped questioning it. "He says my body is just exhausted from carrying the baby. That the asthma is worse because my lungs are compressed. He says I need to rest more. What do you think?" I asked. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw what I'd seen in the eyes of witnesses who knew the truth but were too frightened to say it out loud. "I think something is very wrong with me," she said. After I settled her back in bed, I sat in my study and did something I hadn't done in years. I thought like a judge, not like a father, not like a worried old man. Like the federal judge who had spent 35 years evaluating evidence, identifying patterns, and separating truth from carefully constructed lies. I made a list. Rachel's symptoms, the ones that didn't fit asthma. Progressive shortness of breath. Yes, that could be asthma. But the hemoptysis, coughing blood, that was unusual. The extreme fatigue beyond what pregnancy should cause. The jaundice. The faint yellowing of her eyes I'd noticed 2 days ago. The weight loss during a third trimester when she should have been gaining. The tremors in her hands. The orthopnea. Difficulty breathing while lying flat. That woke her at night, gasping. I'd seen these symptoms before. Not in person. In evidence. 20 years ago, I'd presided over a case where a man named Gerald Fenton had slowly poisoned his wife with a common herbicide. The symptoms had mimicked chronic lung disease so perfectly that 2 doctors had missed it. Fenton's wife had died, and it was only during the autopsy that a forensic pathologist found the truth. I sentenced Fenton to life without parole. The parallel made my stomach turn. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was an old man, seeing conspiracy in coincidence, that Nathan, for all his flaws, was not capable of something that monstrous. That afternoon, I positioned myself in the kitchen early, before Nathan came downstairs. I wanted to see his morning routine with Rachel's medication. He appeared at 7:45, dressed for another day of supposed job hunting. He went to the coat closet in the hallway, reached into the inside pocket of his gray jacket, and pulled out a small amber bottle. Not from the bathroom medicine cabinet where medications belonged. From his coat pocket, he shook 2 pills into his palm. One was large and oval, a standard prenatal vitamin. I recognized the brand. The other was small, round, and white. No markings. No imprint. He closed his fist around both and walked to the kitchen where Rachel sat with her tea. "Morning, babe. Don't forget these." He placed the pills on the table beside her mug, kissed the top of her head, and poured himself coffee, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Rachel picked up both pills, put them in her mouth, and swallowed them with water. She didn't examine them. She didn't question them. She trusted him completely. Nathan caught my eye across the kitchen and smiled. "Making sure Mama stays healthy," he said. I smiled back. But inside, something had gone very cold and very still. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, I went downstairs for water and saw light bleeding from under the study door. Nathan's voice carried through the old wood, low and urgent. I stood in the dark hallway and listened. "She's getting worse every day. Exactly like you said she would." A pause. "The policy pays out $3.2 million. That's more than enough to cover everything I owe you and set us up clean." Another pause. Longer. I know. I'm not going to mess this up. Tell him I'll have the money by mid-October. Every cent." A sharp laugh. "Yeah, well, tell Salerno that patience pays. He should know that better than anyone." The name detonated in my chest like a buried mine. Victor Salerno. I hadn't spoken that name in 15 years, but I'd never forgotten it. How could I? Salerno had run the largest illegal sports gambling operation on the East Coast, a network that moved $40 million a year through shell companies, offshore accounts, and intimidation. His trial lasted 6 weeks. I presided. The evidence was overwhelming. When I delivered the sentence, 12 years in federal prison, Salerno stood in my courtroom, looked me dead in the eye, and said words I had never forgotten. "You'll regret this, Judge Graves. I'm a patient man. I'll find a way to destroy everything you love. Everything." The marshals had dragged him out. I'd written it off as the empty threat of a convicted man. Salerno had served his time and been released 3 years ago. I'd assumed he'd disappeared into whatever life awaited disgraced gamblers. Standing in that dark hallway at 2 in the morning, listening to my son casually discuss insurance payouts and debts to a man who had sworn to destroy me, I understood something with terrible clarity. My son wasn't just killing his wife for money. He was a weapon. A carefully aimed, patiently loaded weapon being pointed at me by a man who had waited 15 years for this moment. And I had opened my front door and invited that weapon into my home. The next morning, after Nathan left for another fabricated appointment and Rachel was resting upstairs, I locked myself in my study and opened the fireproof safe in the corner. Inside, behind insurance documents and Dorothy's jewelry box, sat a row of manila folders I hadn't touched in years. Case files, the ones I'd kept after retirement, the cases that stayed with me, the ones that visited me at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. I found Salerno's folder near the back. It was thick, heavy with transcripts and photographs and evidence summaries. I opened it on my desk, and 15 years fell away. Victor Salerno had been 62 when I sentenced him. A compact man with silver hair, expensive suits, and the dead calm eyes of someone who had ordered terrible things done to people and slept soundly afterward. He'd built his gambling empire over 3 decades, starting with backroom card games in Charlotte and expanding into a network that stretched from Atlanta to Philadelphia. $40 million a year, laundered through restaurants, car washes, and shell corporations. When people couldn't pay their debts, Salerno's men collected in ways that left scars. The trial had been meticulous. 6 weeks of testimony, 37 witnesses, a mountain of financial records that my clerk spent months organizing. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and returned guilty on all 14 counts. Racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, extortion, conspiracy. I sentenced him to 12 years. It should have been 20, but the sentencing guidelines at the time limited my options. When I read the sentence, Salerno stood in his tailored charcoal suit, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me with an expression I'd only seen a handful of times in 35 years on the bench. Not anger. Something colder. Patience. "You'll regret this, Judge Graves," he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "I'm a patient man. 12 years is nothing. I'll wait. And when I'm out, I'll find a way to destroy everything you love. Everything." The marshals took his arms. As they led him toward the side door, he turned back one final time. That's when I saw her. A young woman in the front row of the gallery, early 20s, dark hair, tears streaming down her face. She was gripping the wooden railing so hard her knuckles were white. As Salerno passed her, he reached out and touched her hand, just briefly, and whispered something I couldn't hear. The girl looked at me then, and her eyes held the same cold patience as her grandfather's. I'd noted her in my case journal that evening. Brianna Walsh, Salerno's granddaughter, raised by him after her parents' drug convictions. His only family, his only soft spot. I closed the file and sat back. 15 years. Salerno had served his 12, been released 3 years ago, and apparently spent every day since then constructing his revenge. Not a crude revenge, not a bullet or a bomb, but something elegant and devastating. Something that would destroy me from the inside out. He'd found Nathan, my weak, indebted, morally bankrupt son. He'd wrapped Nathan in gambling debts, introduced him to Brianna, and aimed them both at the one thing that would hurt me most: my family. The doorbell rang that Friday afternoon and confirmed everything. I was in the garden, pruning Dorothy's rhododendrons, when I heard an unfamiliar car pull into the driveway. Through the bushes, I watched a woman step out of a white Mercedes. She was young, late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail and clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Designer sunglasses, heels that clicked sharply on the stone walkway. Nathan met her at the front door before she could ring the bell. I watched through the garden hedge as they stood on the porch, voices low. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not a handshake. She held it, her fingers intertwining with his, her other hand sliding up his arm in a gesture that erased any ambiguity. "The timeline's perfect," she said. Her voice carried in the still mountain air. "After she's gone, we're free. Grandpa says mid-October at the latest." I stared at her through the leaves, and 15 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. The dark hair was auburn now, the face had matured, but the eyes were the same. Cold, patient. The eyes of the young woman who had sat in the front row of my courtroom and watched me sentence her grandfather to prison. Brianna Walsh, Victor Salerno's granddaughter. Standing on my porch, holding my son's hand, discussing my daughter-in-law's murder timeline. They went inside. I heard the study door close and lock. I stood in the garden, my pruning shears hanging at my side, and felt the full architecture of Salerno's revenge reveal itself. It was elegant. It was patient. It was monstrous. He'd waited 15 years. He'd found Nathan. Probably sought him out deliberately. A judge's son, with a gambling addiction and no moral center. He'd buried Nathan in debt, then offered a way out, marry a woman, insure her life, poison her slowly, collect the money. And the instrument of that poison, the woman pulling the strings alongside Nathan, was Salerno's own granddaughter, his protégé. His weapon aimed at the judge who had taken 12 years of his life. This wasn't about money. The $3.2 million was just the mechanism. This was about destruction. Salerno wanted to take my daughter-in-law, my grandchild's mother, and then watch as my son went to prison for murder, completing the devastation. He would destroy my family the way I had destroyed his empire, and he almost succeeded. He would have succeeded if he hadn't underestimated one thing, the same instinct that had built my career. The ability to see what people were hiding, to read the evidence they thought they'd buried. After Nathan and Brianna left the house separately that afternoon, after Rachel had fallen asleep upstairs, I went into Nathan's bedroom. My hands were steady. Whatever emotion was churning beneath the surface, I'd learned to compartmentalize it decades ago. On the bench, you don't get to feel until after the verdict. The amber bottle was in the inside pocket of his gray jacket, hanging in the closet. I unscrewed the cap and tipped one small white pill into my palm. Round. Unmarked. No pharmaceutical imprint. No manufacturer's code. Nothing. Just a smooth, anonymous tablet that could have been anything. I dropped it into a plastic zip bag, sealed it, and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Then I replaced the bottle exactly as I'd found it, checked the closet for any sign of disturbance, and left the room. I held that small pill between my fingers and understood that whatever this was, it was killing Rachel one dose at a time. My son was delivering it to her every morning with a smile and a kiss on the head. My granddaughter was growing inside a woman whose body was being systematically destroyed. And a man I'd sentenced 15 years ago was sitting somewhere, watching his masterpiece unfold. I was going to find out what this pill was, and then I was going to stop it. Whatever it cost me. Dr. Martin Aldridge called me on a Thursday evening, 2 days after I'd handed him the pill at a quiet booth in a coffee shop downtown. Martin and I went back decades. He'd served as an expert toxicology witness in my courtroom more times than either of us could count. I trusted his discretion the way I trusted his science, completely. When my phone rang, I was in the study with the door locked. I picked up on the first ring. "Walter," Martin said, and his voice told me everything before his words did. It was the voice he used on the witness stand when delivering findings that would change the trajectory of a trial. Grave. Measured. Certain. "Where the hell did you get this pill?" "Paraquat. It's a herbicide, an agricultural chemical used to kill weeds." He paused. "In the right concentration, it kills people too. Specifically, it destroys lung tissue, causes progressive pulmonary fibrosis. The lungs slowly scar and harden until they can no longer exchange oxygen. Death occurs over weeks or months depending on dosage. The concentration in this tablet is not accidental," Martin continued. "Someone formulated this deliberately. Low dose. Designed for chronic administration. Daily ingestion over 2 to 4 months would cause progressive respiratory failure. The symptoms would present as worsening asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Shortness of breath, coughing, hemoptysis, fatigue, weight loss." He paused again. "In a pregnant woman, most physicians would attribute these symptoms to pregnancy complications or pre-existing respiratory conditions. It would go undetected in standard prenatal blood work. How long does she have?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like it was coming from the far end of a hallway. "If she's been taking this daily for the duration you described, roughly 6 to 8 weeks, she's already sustained significant lung damage. Without intervention, another 3 to 4 weeks of continued exposure would likely be fatal, possibly sooner given the stress of late pregnancy and childbirth. 3 weeks. Rachel had 3 weeks to live if I didn't stop this." "Walter," Martin said carefully, "whoever is administering this needs to be stopped immediately, and the patient needs medical attention. The damage already done may be partially reversible if exposure ceases, but she needs to be evaluated by a pulmonologist." "Thank you, Martin. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. You need to call the police." "I will," I said. I didn't know yet if that was true. I hung up and sat in the darkness for a long time. Paraquat. My son was feeding his pregnant wife a herbicide that was dissolving her lungs from the inside, one breakfast at a time, while she thanked him and swallowed it with water. The next morning, I drove to an electronics store and purchased a small wireless camera, the kind designed for home security. That afternoon, while Nathan and Rachel were both out, Nathan at another phantom appointment, and Rachel at a prenatal checkup I'd arranged with Dr. Castillo specifically to get her out of the house, I installed the camera in the study. Positioned on the top shelf of the bookcase, angled toward the desk in the center of the room, hidden behind a row of law journals Nathan would never think to touch. That evening, it recorded its first footage. Nathan and Brianna, sitting on the study couch, speaking freely in what they believed was complete privacy. She can barely make it up the stairs anymore, Nathan said, leaning back, legs crossed, as casual as if discussing weekend plans. Another few weeks, and it won't matter. After the baby comes, her lungs will be so damaged that any post-delivery complication will finish it. Pulmonary embolism, respiratory arrest, cardiac failure. Take your pick. Every single one of them is a plausible cause of death for a woman with severe asthma who just gave birth. Brianna nodded, checking her phone. And Grandpa's contact at the crematorium? Standing by. Quick cremation, no autopsy. We've got a sympathetic funeral director who owes Salerno a favor. By the time anyone thinks to ask questions, there won't be any evidence left to find. The camera captured everything in crisp, time-stamped high definition. Over the next 4 days, I built my case the way I'd built hundreds of cases from the other side of the bench. Methodically, thoroughly, leaving no gaps for reasonable doubt. I recorded Nathan's phone calls to Salerno through the study camera. In one, Salerno's voice came through the speakerphone, smooth and unhurried. Your father took 15 years from me, Nathan. Now I take everything from him. His daughter-in-law, his grandchild's mother, and then you, his own son, in prison for murder. When it's done, Walter Graves will have nothing left. Poetic, isn't it? Nathan laughed. Poetic. He agreed. I photographed the audio. I captured screenshots. I documented timestamps. Then I found the laptop. Nathan had left it open in the study one afternoon, still logged in. His search history read like an instruction manual for murder. Paraquat pulmonary fibrosis timeline. How long does paraquat remain detectable in blood? Life insurance claim processing after death. Countries without United States extradition treaty. Belize residency requirements for Americans. His email account held 8 months of correspondence with Salerno. Planning, scheduling, calculating. A folder labeled insurance contained the policy. I opened it and read the words that made the room tilt. Insured. Rachel Nguyen. Graves. Beneficiary. Nathan Graves. Death benefit. $3,200,000. Effective date. October of the previous year. 1 month after their marriage. I photographed every page, every email, every search result. I copied the critical files onto a USB drive, encrypted it, and locked it in my fireproof safe alongside Salerno's old case file. Then I sat in the dark study, a glass of bourbon in my hand that I couldn't bring myself to drink, and forced myself to confront what I now knew with absolute certainty. My son was poisoning his pregnant wife with a herbicide that was destroying her lungs. He was doing it under the direction of Victor Salerno, a man I had sentenced 15 years ago, who had spent every year since planning this revenge. The insurance policy would pay $3.2 million upon Rachel's death. Salerno would recover the debts Nathan owed him. Nathan and Brianna would flee to Belize, and Rachel would be dead, cremated before anyone could find the truth. My granddaughter would grow up motherless, and Salerno would have his revenge. I sat there until the bourbon went warm, and the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. I had evidence. I had proof. I had everything a prosecutor would need to put Nathan, Brianna, and Salerno behind bars for decades. But Nathan was my son, Dorothy's boy. The child I had held in my arms the day he was born. The boy who had once climbed into my lap and asked me to read him stories about knights and castles. Save my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter. Or protect my son. The evidence demanded one answer. My heart begged for another. And somewhere upstairs, Rachel was sleeping in Dorothy's chair, one hand on her belly, trusting the people around her to keep her safe, not knowing that one of those people was killing her, and the other was sitting in the dark trying to decide what to do about it. 3 weeks. That's how long Rachel had left. 3 weeks to make the hardest decision of my life. I made my decision before dawn. I sat in the study watching the sky lighten through the window, the Blue Ridge emerging from darkness in slow degrees, And I understood something with the clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent staring at an impossible choice. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. Rachel was going to die in 3 weeks if I did nothing. My granddaughter was going to lose her mother before she drew her first breath. No amount of loyalty to my son could justify allowing that to happen. Nathan had made his choices. Now I would make mine. I waited until he left the house that morning, watched his car wind down the mountain road and disappear into the tree line. Then I went upstairs. Rachel was in the guest room, sitting by the window, one hand resting on her belly. She looked exhausted. Her skin had taken on that grayish pallor that frightened me more each day. And her breathing was shallow, labored. The sound of lungs that were slowly losing their ability to do the one thing lungs exist to do. When she saw me in the doorway, she tried to smile. "Rachel," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need you to come downstairs with me. There's something we have to talk about." Something in my tone must have reached her. Her eyes widened. "Is it the baby? Is something wrong with Hope?" "Hope is fine. But this is important. Can you come down?" She nodded. I helped her stand, steadied her on the stairs. In the living room, I guided her to Dorothy's chair by the bay window. I pulled the ottoman close so she could rest her feet, then sat across from her, hands clasped, the way I used to sit, before delivering a verdict. How do you tell someone that the person they trust most in the world is killing them? "Rachel," I began, then stopped. She was watching me with those wide brown eyes, her hands on her belly, her whole body oriented toward protecting the life inside her. She was terrified, and I hadn't even started. "You're scaring me, Walter." "I know, and I'm sorry." I leaned forward. "Rachel, I need you to hear what I'm about to say, and I need you to believe me. I have proof for everything I'm going to tell you. The pills Nathan gives you every morning, the small white one, it's not asthma medication, it's paraquat. It's a herbicide, a poison that destroys lung tissue. He's been giving it to you for at least 6 weeks. That's why you've been getting weaker. That's why you're coughing blood. That's why your lungs are failing." I paused, watching the color drain from her face. "Nathan took out a life insurance policy on you. $3.2 million. He's planning to let you die after the baby is born and collect the payout. He's working with a woman named Brianna Walsh, and they're both taking orders from a man named Victor Salerno." Rachel stared at me. For a moment, the room was completely silent, except for the ticking of Dorothy's mantel clock and the distant sound of wind in the pines outside. Then she began to shake. It started in her hands and moved through her whole body. A tremor that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She pressed both hands against her belly as if trying to shield hope from the words. I moved to kneel beside her chair and took her freezing hands. "Breathe. Rachel. Stay with me. You know?" She gasped finally. "You actually know. I know everything. I have the pills tested by a toxicologist. I have recordings from a camera in the study. I have his emails, his search history, the insurance documents. It's all documented." She was crying hard now, but there was something beneath the tears that I didn't expect. Not just devastation, recognition. The look of someone who had suspected a terrible truth and just received confirmation. "You suspected," I said gently. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. 3 weeks ago, I started feeling so much worse, so suddenly. And Nathan, he was so insistent about the pills every morning. If I said I'd take them later, he got cold, angry, made me feel guilty for being ungrateful. She looked at me, tears and fury mixed together. "I'm a nurse, Walter. I know what normal pregnancy symptoms look like. What I've been feeling is not normal. But every time I tried to say something, he shut me down, told me I was being paranoid. Told me first-time mothers always overreact. Once, he went quiet and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Like I was a problem he was calculating how to solve. I never brought it up again. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I knew. I didn't have proof, but I knew. Rachel, I need to tell you something else. The reason Nathan is doing this goes beyond money. Victor Salerno is a man I sentenced to 12 years in federal prison 15 years ago. He swore to destroy my family. Brianna Walsh is his granddaughter. This entire thing, your marriage, the pregnancy, the insurance, the poison, it's all part of Salerno's revenge against me. She absorbed this in silence. Then something changed in her face. The fear didn't disappear, but something harder rose up beside it. She wiped her eyes one final time, took a breath, and stood up from the chair. Slowly, carefully, holding her belly, she walked to the bookshelf beside the window. She reached up and took down the stuffed bear she'd been knitting for the baby. A soft brown teddy bear with blue button eyes, half finished. Yarn still trailing from one leg. She'd been working on it every evening for weeks, needles clicking quietly while we talked in the library. She turned it over, found a seam along the back, and pulled it open. Inside, nestled against the stuffing, was a cell phone. An old model, scuffed and cracked but functional. She pulled it out and held it up. I was building my own case, Your Honor. I stared at her, then at the phone, then back at her. 3 weeks, she said, her voice steady now, transformed. I've been recording Nathan for 3 weeks. Every conversation in the bedroom, every phone call I could hear through the walls, Brianna's visits when he thought I was sleeping. She pressed the phone into my hands. There are over 40 hours of audio on here. I recorded him talking to Brianna about the dosage. I recorded him on speakerphone with Salerno planning the timeline. I recorded him telling Brianna what he'd do with the money after I was gone. In 35 years on the bench, I had seen thousands of witnesses. I had heard testimony that moved me, angered me, and occasionally astonished me. But I had never, not once, seen courage like what I was looking at in that moment. A woman who had been slowly poisoned for weeks, who was frightened and pregnant and alone, had done what trained investigators do. She had gathered evidence. Methodically, secretly, hidden inside a teddy bear she was knitting for the daughter she wasn't sure she would live to raise. Rachel, I said. And my voice broke. Don't cry yet, Grandpa, she said. And that word, Grandpa, the first time she'd ever used it, broke something open in my chest that I didn't know was still sealed. We can cry later. Right now. Tell me the plan. That morning, Rachel took the prenatal vitamin Nathan handed her and palmed the small white pill. She brought her hand to her mouth with the water, swallowed the vitamin, and slipped the paraquat into her pocket. Nathan noticed nothing. He kissed her forehead and left for the day. It was the last dose of poison she would ever take. Thomas Pritchard arrived at my house the next morning at 9. Sharp, carrying the same battered leather briefcase he'd carried since law school. Tom and I had known each other for over 40 years, since we were both young attorneys trying to find our footing in a system that didn't suffer fools. He'd gone into private practice while I went to the bench. But we'd stayed close through decades. Through Dorothy's death. Through everything. He was the only person outside my family I trusted without reservation. I led him to the study, locked the door, and handed him the USB drive. Everything's on here, I said. But let me walk you through it first. For the next hour, I laid it out. The paraquat. Dr. Aldridge's analysis. The camera footage of Nathan and Brianna planning Rachel's death. The recordings from Rachel's phone hidden inside the teddy bear. Salerno's emails. The insurance policy. The search history. The timeline. All of it. Piece by piece. The way I would have presented a case to a jury. Tom listened without interrupting. He was good at that. His face moved through several expressions. Concern. Then shock. then a cold fury I'd only seen once before, when his own daughter had been stalked by an ex-boyfriend years ago. When I finished, he sat back, removed his glasses, and cleaned them slowly on his tie. It was his thinking ritual. I'd seen him do it 1,000 times. "This is airtight, Walter," he said finally. "Every piece of evidence is admissible. The camera footage was recorded in your home, on your property, which you own outright. Rachel's recordings fall under one-party consent in North Carolina. The toxicology report is from a certified expert. The digital evidence, emails, search history, insurance documents, all obtained from an unlocked device in your home." He paused. "We could take this to the FBI right now and have Nathan arrested by dinner time." Tom looked at me sharply. "What do you mean? Rachel is due in 2 weeks. If we arrest Nathan now, she goes into labor knowing her husband tried to kill her. She testifies while recovering from childbirth. She endures months of trial while trying to bond with a newborn. The stress could endanger her and the baby." I leaned forward. "And Nathan is just the instrument. Salerno is the architect. If we only arrest Nathan, Salerno disappears. He's done it before. He has the resources and the connections to vanish, and he'll spend the rest of his life planning his next revenge." Tom studied me. "What are you proposing?" I told him. It took another 30 minutes. By the end, he was sitting very still, his glasses forgotten in his hand, staring at me with an expression caught between admiration and disbelief. "A fake funeral," he said slowly. "You want to let Nathan think Rachel is dead. Stage a funeral at Basilica of St. Lawrence. Invite everyone. Then play the evidence in front of 250 witnesses while FBI arrests Nathan, Brianna, and Salerno in the same room. Salerno will come," I said. "He won't be able to resist watching his masterpiece. He'll want to see me broken, grieving over a casket. He'll want to witness the destruction he orchestrated. That arrogance is his weakness. It always has been." Tom was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone. "I know someone at the FBI field office in Charlotte. Special Agent Marcus Holt. He runs organized crime. He's been building a case against Salerno's network for 2 years but hasn't been able to get enough evidence for an arrest warrant. Our evidence is his missing piece. More than that. Our evidence connects Salerno directly to conspiracy, to commit murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering. Combined with what the FBI already has, it's enough to dismantle his entire operation." Tom dialed. "Marcus, it's Tom Pritchard. I need a meeting. Today. If possible. I have something that's going to make your year." We met Agent Holt that afternoon at Tom's office downtown. Holt was in his mid-40s, lean and sharp-eyed, with the controlled energy of a man who had spent years hunting a target he couldn't quite reach. When he reviewed the evidence, his expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained intensity. "We've been tracking Salerno since his release," Holt said, spreading photographs across the conference table. "Surveillance images, financial records, communication intercepts. We knew he was rebuilding, but we couldn't prove the direct connection between his network and specific criminal acts. This," he tapped the USB drive, "this gives us everything. The recordings alone are enough for conspiracy charges. Combined with our existing case file, Salerno is looking at 25 years minimum. There's a condition," I said. "We do it my way. The funeral, the public exposure. All 3 arrested simultaneously." Holt looked at Tom, then back at me. "That's unconventional. Salerno is unconventional. If you arrest Nathan alone, Salerno burns everything and disappears. You've been chasing him for 2 years. You know I'm right." Holt considered this for a long moment. "We've confirmed through our surveillance that Salerno has been monitoring your household situation. He's invested in this personally. There's a high probability he would attend the funeral to witness the result of his operation." He paused. "We'll have agents at every exit. Plainclothes inside, tactical team outside. The moment the evidence plays and identities are confirmed, we move. Arrested simultaneously as an accomplice. The recordings make her complicity irrefutable. We spent another 2 hours planning logistics. The timeline crystallized. Rachel would give birth naturally with Nathan present, maintaining the illusion. Immediately after, Tom and I would move Rachel and the baby to Tom's mountain cabin, 30 miles north. Completely off the grid. Helen Pritchard, Tom's wife and a retired nurse, would stay with them. Dr. Castillo would coordinate the false death announcement, sui ho hup cup, respiratory failure, a plausible complication for an asthmatic woman after difficult labor. 4 days after the birth, we'd hold the funeral at Basilica of St. Lawrence. I would read the indictment. The video would play. Rachel would enter. FBI would close the trap. Meanwhile, Rachel was coming back to life. Each day without the paraquat, the change was visible. Color returned to her face within 72 hours. By the end of the first week, she could climb stairs without stopping. Her appetite returned. Her hands stopped trembling. She ate full meals and kept them down, sometimes closing her eyes after the first bite and just breathing, as if tasting food for the first time in months. "I feel like myself again," she told me one evening. We were in the library, her in Dorothy's chair, me on the sofa. Hope kicked visibly beneath Rachel's shirt, and Rachel laughed, pressing my hand against her belly so I could feel it. "If you hadn't figured it out, Walter, I would be dead by now. Hope would have grown up without a mother. But I did figure it out," I said. "And now we're going to finish this." Nathan noticed nothing. He was too consumed with his own timeline, too busy coordinating with Brianna and reporting to Salerno. I caught him on the phone one evening, voice bright with anticipation. "Any day now. After the baby comes, it'll be quick. I'll have your money by mid-October. Guaranteed." I found custody documents on his desk, predated, requesting sole guardianship of Hope. He was that confident, that certain of his plan's success. He had no idea that the trap had already been set, and he was standing in the center of it. The contractions started at 4 in the morning. I was sitting in the leather chair beside the fireplace, reviewing Thomas's final documents for the 4th time, when I heard Rachel's voice cut through the silence of the lake cabin like a blade through still water. One word. That was all she needed. I was on my feet, before the second syllable faded, moving through the narrow hallway with a speed that surprised even me. The cabin door was open. Rachel stood in the frame, one hand gripping the wooden doorpost, the other pressed flat against the curve of her belly. Her face was pale, sweat glistening along her hairline, but her eyes were steady. Nurses always know. She had known before the first wave of pain even crested. "It's time," she said. Dr. Linda Castillo arrived within 40 minutes. We had arranged everything in advance. No hospital, no records, no digital trail that Nathan or Salerno's network could trace. Linda had driven up from Asheville the previous evening and was staying at a motel 6 miles down the mountain road, waiting for exactly this call. She walked through the door carrying 2 medical bags and a portable fetal monitor. Her expression calm, professional, and utterly unshakable. She had delivered over 3,000 babies in her career. This one, she told me later, was the one she would never forget. Rachel labored for 7 hours. I stayed in the next room for most of it, pacing the pine floor, listening to the sounds that came through the thin walls. The low moans, the sharp inhales, Linda's steady voice guiding Rachel through each contraction. At one point I heard Rachel cry out, not in pain, but in frustration, and Linda responded with a firmness that reminded me of Dorothy. "You're doing this, Rachel. Focus on my voice. Your daughter is almost here." I sat down on the edge of the cot and pressed my palms against my knees. My hands were trembling. 72 years old, 31 years on the federal bench. I had sentenced men to life without parole and never flinched. But sitting in that room, listening to my granddaughter fight her way into the world, I could not keep my hands still. At 11:47 a.m., On August 28th, Hope Dorothy Graves was born. She weighed 5 pounds, 11 ounces. Small, Linda said, but strong. Her lungs were clear. Her heartbeat was steady, 142 beats per minute, a number I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Linda placed her on Rachel's chest, and for a long moment, the cabin was silent. No crying, no words, just the sound of a mother breathing against her daughter's skin and the faint rustle of pine trees outside the window. I stepped into the room. Rachel looked up at me, exhausted. Her dark hair matted against the pillow, and she smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen from her in weeks, not the polite, careful smile she wore around Nathan, not the brave smile she offered when the coughing fits subsided. This was something deeper, something that came from a place the poison had never reached. "Come meet your granddaughter," she whispered. I crossed the room and looked down at the smallest human being I had ever seen. Hope's eyes were closed. Her fingers were curled into loose fists, each one no larger than a walnut. She had a faint dusting of dark hair on her head and a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her left ear. I reached down and touched her hand with my index finger, and she gripped it. Instinct, Linda would tell me. Newborns grip anything that touches their palm. But I knew better. Dorothy would have known better too. "Hello, Hope," I said. My voice broke on her name. "I'm your grandfather, and I promise you, no one will ever hurt you or your mother again." Rachel closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her temple and disappeared into the pillow. Over the next 6 days, we executed the plan with surgical precision. Linda filed a confidential medical report documenting Hope's birth, sealed under a court order Thomas had arranged through a trusted colleague in Buncombe County. No birth announcement, no social media post, no hospital record that could be searched, subpoenaed, or leaked. As far as Nathan Graves and Brianna Walsh knew, Rachel was still pregnant, still weak, still dying on schedule. Rachel's recovery was remarkable. Without the daily paraquat exposure, her body began to repair itself with a resilience that astonished even Linda. The color returned to her cheeks within 48 hours. The tremors in her hands subsided by the 3rd day. Her breathing, while still labored at times, improved steadily. Linda administered a course of N-acetylcysteine to support her lung tissue and monitored her oxygen levels every 4 hours. By September 1st, Rachel could walk the length of the cabin hallway without stopping. I called Thomas on the evening of September 2nd. "We're ready," I told him. "The church is confirmed," Thomas replied. "Father Morrison has agreed." 11 a.m. September 4th. "Nathan believes Rachel died this morning at Mission Hospital. Brianna confirmed delivery of the cremation paperwork. Salerno's people are monitoring from a distance. Marcus has eyes on 2 of them at the Omni Park Hotel downtown." I hung up the phone and walked to the front porch of the cabin. The sun was setting behind the Blue Ridge, painting the sky in bands of copper and violet. Hope was asleep in Rachel's arms inside. In 2 days, I would stand in the Basilica of St. Lawrence and deliver the performance of my life. Not a closing argument, not a sentencing statement. Something far more personal. I thought of Dorothy. I thought of the morning she told me she was pregnant with Nathan. How she had laughed and cried at the same time. How I had lifted her off the kitchen floor and spun her in a circle until we were both dizzy. I thought of the man Nathan had become, and the man he had chosen not to be. And I thought of Hope, 5 pounds, 11 ounces of possibility, sleeping inside a cabin on a mountain, unaware that in 48 hours, her existence would be the most powerful evidence I had ever presented. The sky darkened. The stars appeared, one by one, like witnesses taking their seats. "Dorothy," I whispered into the night air. "Watch over us." The wind moved through the pines, and for a moment, just a moment, it sounded like someone was answering. I woke at 5:30 on the morning of September 4th to the sound of rain. Not the violent, crashing rain that had brought Nathan to my door 3 months earlier, but a slow, deliberate drizzle, the kind that settles over the mountains like a veil, muting every color softening every edge. I lay in the narrow cot at the lake cabin and listened to it tap against the tin roof, counting each drop the way I once counted seconds before delivering a verdict. Steady, measured, final. I rose and walked to the bathroom. The mirror showed me a man I barely recognized. My eyes were swollen from a night of fragmented sleep. The lines on my face seemed deeper than they had been in June, carved not by age but by the weight of what I had learned about my own son. I splashed cold water on my cheeks, straightened my back, and stared at my reflection until the man staring back resembled a federal judge again. The black suit hung on the back of the door. I had pressed it myself the night before a three-piece charcoal wool that Dorothy had chosen for me 11 years ago at a tailor on Lexington Avenue during our last trip to New York. She had run her fingers along the lapel and said, "This is the suit they'll remember you in, Walter." She had meant it for a retirement ceremony, not for this. But Dorothy had always understood presentation. "Appearance is the first argument you make," she used to say. I dressed slowly. White shirt, silver cufflinks, the pair Dorothy gave me on our 30th anniversary, engraved with the initials WG, black tie, knotted once, adjusted twice. I slipped the USB drive into the inner breast pocket of the jacket, directly over my heart. Then I reached into the bedside drawer and removed a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Dorothy holding Nathan the day he was born, her face radiant, her arms certain. I tucked it into the pocket beside the USB. Today she would be with me in both rooms, the room where I buried my son's lie and the room where my granddaughter breathed her first free air. At 6:15, I checked on Rachel. She was already awake, sitting upright in the cabin's main bedroom, nursing Hope in the pale gray light. The baby was latched and quiet, her tiny hand resting against Rachel's collarbone. Rachel wore a simple white blouse chosen deliberately, Thomas had suggested. For the moment she would walk through the church doors. White against mahogany. Life against death. The jury always notices contrast. "How do you feel?" I asked from the doorway. Rachel looked up. Her eyes were clear, steadier than I had ever seen them. The tremors were gone. The jaundice had faded. 6 days without the poison, and her body had staged its own quiet rebellion against everything Nathan had tried to do to it. I nodded. "Thomas will be here at 7. Agent Holt's team is already positioned. 2 agents at the Omni, monitoring Salerno's people. 3 inside the church in plain clothes. And a tactical unit parked on Haywood Street, 2 blocks from the Basilica." I paused. "Father Morrison knows. He'll proceed with the service as planned, until Thomas gives the signal." Rachel adjusted Hope against her shoulder and patted her back gently. "What about Nathan?" "Nathan arrived at the house on Sunset Mountain last night," I said. "He's been there since 9. Brianna arrived at 10:15. They've been making phone calls," Marcus confirmed, 3 outgoing calls to a burner registered to one of Salerno's associates in Charlotte. I let the information settle. "He believes you're dead, Rachel. He believes Hope died with you. He spent last night in my living room, rehearsing grief." Rachel's jaw tightened. She said nothing for a long moment, then pressed her lips against Hope's forehead. "Then, let's give him the performance he deserves." Thomas Pritchard arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, driving a black sedan with tinted windows. He stepped out wearing a navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that contained 3 copies of every document we had gathered. The Paraquat lab analysis, the insurance policy, the email chain between Nathan and Salerno, Rachel's 40-plus hours of audio, the hidden camera footage from my study, Nathan's search history, and the financial transfers linking Brianna Walsh's account to a pharmaceutical supplier in Juarez. Each copy was notarized. Each was admissible. "Morning, Walter." Thomas shook my hand at the door. His grip was firm, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. He had been a trial attorney for 38 years. He knew the stakes. Marcus confirmed the church is secure. Salerno's man, the one who's been watching from the hotel, left at 5 a.m. and drove to the Basilica. He's sitting in the last pew. They want eyes on the funeral. Good, I said. Let them watch. Thomas opened the briefcase on the kitchen table and handed me a single sheet of heavy cream paper. At the top, in 14-point Times New Roman, were the words I had written at 3 in the morning. In the matter of Nathan Graves, a father's indictment. I read it once more. Every sentence was precise. Every accusation was supported by evidence. Every word was chosen not to persuade, but to dismantle. This was not a eulogy. It was a verdict delivered not from a bench, but from a broken heart. I folded the paper, slid it into my jacket beside the USB and Dorothy's photograph, and looked at Thomas. Let's go bury a lie, I said. Thomas drove. I sat in the back seat, watching Asheville emerge through the rain-streaked window. The streets were quiet. Sunday morning, church bells somewhere in the distance. We passed the turn for Sunset Mountain, and I looked up at the road that led to my house, the house where Nathan was likely standing in front of a mirror at this very moment, adjusting his own tie, practicing the expression of a grieving husband. I wondered if he had rehearsed tears. I wondered if any part of him, any fragment buried beneath the lies and the debt, and Salerno's poison felt something real. At 10:15 we arrived at the Basilica of St. Lawrence. The stone facade rose against the gray sky like a monument to permanence, its copper dome darkened by rain. Cars were already lining the street. Thomas had arranged for 60 guests, a mix of community members, colleagues from Rachel's nursing days, and a handful of individuals who had no idea what they were about to witness. Father Morrison stood at the side entrance in his vestments, his face solemn. He shook my hand without a word and gestured toward the nave. I stepped inside. The air smelled of incense and wet stone and lilies. Rows of mahogany pews stretched toward the altar, where a closed casket sat on a raised platform, draped in white cloth. Empty. The casket was empty, weighted with sandbags to feel authentic if anyone placed a hand on it. Thomas's idea. Thorough, as always. I took my seat in the third row, left side. The same seat I had described in the opening of this story. The same seat from which I would watch my son walk through those doors with his mistress on his arm. The same seat from which I would rise, press play, and end the lie he had built on the bones of a woman he had promised to love. I placed my hand over the breast pocket of my jacket and felt the edges of 3 objects: the USB drive, the indictment, and Dorothy's photograph. The church bells rang 11 times. I started counting down. Nathan arrived at 11:07, 7 minutes late. Even at his wife's funeral, my son could not be punctual. The heavy oak doors of the Basilica of St. Lawrence swung open, and the gray morning light flooded the nave like a searchlight. Every head turned. Every whisper stopped. And there he stood, my son, Nathan Graves, 41 years old, wearing a black Italian suit that I knew he could not afford. His dark hair combed back, his jaw set in an expression I had seen 1,000 times in my courtroom. The carefully constructed mask of a man who believed he had gotten away with something. Brianna Walsh stood beside him. She wore a fitted black dress, her auburn hair pulled into a low chignon, her hand resting on Nathan's forearm with the casual possessiveness of a woman who had already claimed her prize. She was not crying. She was not even pretending. Her eyes moved across the pews with a sharpness that reminded me of her grandfather, Victor Salerno, who had once scanned my courtroom with the same predatory calm before I sentenced him to 12 years. The resemblance was not physical. It was behavioral, learned, inherited like a disease. They walked down the center aisle together. I watched them from the third row, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing measured, the indictment paper pressed against my chest. The USB drive sat beside it like a second heartbeat. Nathan glanced at me as he passed. He offered a single nod, solemn, practiced, empty, and continued toward the front pew. Brianna did not look at me at all. She kept her gaze fixed on the mahogany casket draped in white. The casket she believed held the woman she had helped murder. The satisfaction in her posture was subtle, but I had spent 3 decades reading body language from the bench. She was pleased. They sat down. Nathan placed his hand on the casket for 3 seconds, bowed his head, and withdrew. Performance. Every gesture rehearsed. I thought of Rachel, 6 miles away in the lake cabin, alive, breathing, holding our granddaughter. I thought of the 40 hours of audio hidden inside a teddy bear. I thought of Dorothy, who would have wept not for what Nathan had done, but for who he had chosen to become. Father Morrison began the service. His voice was deep and steady, filling the basilica's domed ceiling with words about mercy and loss and the fragility of human life. He read from Ecclesiastes, a time to be born and a time to die, and the congregation murmured their amens. Nathan stared at his hands. Brianna examined the stained glass above the altar. In the last pew, a man I did not recognize sat with his arms crossed and his phone on his thigh. Salerno's watcher. Agent Holt's team had identified him as Dominic Ferraro, 44, a mid-level enforcer from Charlotte who had served 4 years under Salerno's operation. He was here to confirm the death, to report back that the job was done. 20 minutes into the service, Father Morrison paused. He looked toward the third row. He looked at me. At this time, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood exactly what was about to happen, the father of the deceased's husband would like to share a few words. The pew creaked beneath me. The sound echoed off the stone walls. I buttoned the middle button of my jacket, Dorothy's suit, Dorothy's cufflinks, Dorothy's memory holding me upright, and walked to the lectern. I did not look at Nathan. Not yet. I placed my hands on the wooden surface and gazed out at the congregation. 60 faces. Some I knew, some I did not. 3 of them were federal agents. 1 of them was a killer's errand boy, and 1 of them, my son, was the architect of a murder that had never been completed. I unfolded the cream paper from my breast pocket. My name is Walter Graves, I said. I served 31 years as a federal judge in the Western District of North Carolina. I have delivered over 400 sentences. I have looked into the eyes of men who committed unspeakable acts and told them, on behalf of the United States of America, what their actions would cost them. I paused. Today, I am not speaking as a judge. I am speaking as a father, and what I have to say will not be a eulogy. The silence in the basilica was absolute. Nathan's head lifted. His eyes met mine. For the first time since he had walked through those doors, his mask flickered. 3 months ago, my son Nathan Graves arrived at my home on Sunset Mountain with his wife, Rachel Nguyen Graves, and a story I wanted to believe. He told me they had fallen on hard times. He told me Rachel was pregnant and needed a safe place to rest. He asked me to open my door. I let the words settle against the stone. I opened my door, and in return, my son turned my home into a crime scene. A murmur rippled through the pews. Nathan's hand tightened on the armrest. On July 14th, I discovered an unmarked white pill in my son's coat pocket. He had been giving this pill to Rachel every morning, alongside her prenatal vitamin, telling her it was medication for her asthma. It was not. I looked directly at Nathan. The pill was paraquat, a commercial herbicide. Administered daily in microdoses, it causes progressive pulmonary fibrosis, the slow, irreversible destruction of the lungs. My son was poisoning his pregnant wife to death. Nathan stood. "Dad, sit down," I said. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. 31 years of courtroom authority carried the command like a gavel strike. Nathan sat. The motive was a life insurance policy. I continued. $3.2 million. Taken out 8 months ago, listing Nathan Graves as the sole beneficiary of Rachel Nguyen Graves' death. The policy was facilitated by Brianna Walsh. I turned my gaze to her and watched the color drain from her face. The granddaughter of Victor Salerno, a convicted racketeer, whom I sentenced to 12 years in federal prison in 2011. This was not greed alone. This was revenge. I reached into my jacket and retrieved the USB drive. Thomas Pritchard rose from his seat in the second row, crossed to the AV cabinet beside the altar, and inserted the drive into the system Father Morrison had approved 48 hours earlier. The basilica's projection screen descended silently behind the casket. "What you are about to see," I said, "is evidence." The screen illuminated. Nathan's face appeared captured by the hidden camera in my study leaning across my desk, speaking to Brianna. His voice filled the church, amplified by the speakers embedded in the stone walls. "She's got maybe 3 weeks. The cough is getting worse. Salerno says we file the claim within 48 hours of the death certificate." Brianna's voice answered. "And the cremation? Already arranged. No autopsy. No questions." The congregation erupted. Gasps. Chairs scraping. Someone in the fourth row covered her mouth. Nathan surged to his feet, his face white, his composure shattered like glass against marble. Brianna grabbed her purse and turned toward the aisle. "Federal agents are stationed at every exit," I said calmly. "I would not recommend leaving." The video was still playing when the side door of the basilica opened. It opened slowly, not with the dramatic force of Nathan's entrance, but with the quiet, deliberate precision of someone who had survived something no one in this room could imagine. The hinges did not creak. The wood did not slam. A sliver of pale September light cut across the stone floor like a blade, widening inch by inch, and the congregation turned not all at once, but in a wave, row by row, breath by breath toward the source. Rachel Nguyen Graves stepped into the Basilica of St. Lawrence, carrying her daughter in her arms. She wore the white blouse I had seen her button that morning at the cabin. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders, clean and brushed, catching the light from the stained glass windows. Her face was thin, the weeks of poisoning had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones that had not yet filled, but her eyes burned with something I had never seen in a courtroom, something no judge could manufacture, and no verdict could replicate. Certainty. Not legal certainty, not evidentiary certainty. The certainty of a woman who had walked through death and decided to come back. Hope was asleep against her chest, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket that Rachel had knitted during the final nights at the cabin. 5 pounds. 11 ounces of evidence that Nathan Graves had failed. The congregation did not gasp. That is what people expect. The collective inhale, the cinematic shock. But what happened was something far more devastating. Silence. A silence so complete that I could hear the candle flames bending in the draft from the open door. 60 people staring at a dead woman who was not dead, holding a child who was not supposed to exist, walking down the side aisle of a church where her empty casket sat draped in white cloth on the altar. Nathan saw her last. He had been facing me, his mouth open, his hands raised in some half-formed gesture of denial when he registered the shift in the room. The heads turning, the silence deepening. He turned slowly the way a man turns when he already knows what he is going to see, but cannot stop himself from looking, and his eyes found Rachel. The sound that came from his throat was not a word. It was not a scream. It was something primitive and involuntary. The sound of a man whose entire architecture of lies collapsed in a single second. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the pew, his fingers white against the dark wood, and stared at the woman he had been killing for 8 weeks as she walked past him without a glance. Brianna did not make a sound. She simply stopped moving. Her hand, still clutching her purse, froze at her side. Her face became a mask, not of shock, but of calculation. I recognized the expression. Her grandfather had worn the same one when the jury foreman read guilty 14 times in a row. She was already thinking about exits, about lawyers, about what could be denied. But there was nowhere to go, and there was nothing left to deny. Rachel reached the lectern. She stood beside me, close enough that I could smell the lavender soap from the cabin, close enough that I could see the faint pulse in her neck, beating steady and strong. She looked out at the congregation, then down at Hope, then at me. "May I?" she said. Rachel leaned into the microphone. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The basilica's acoustics carried it to every corner, every pew, every ear. "My name is Rachel Nguyen Graves," she said. "3 months ago, the man sitting in the front row began poisoning me with a herbicide called paraquat. He crushed it into a white pill and gave it to me every morning, telling me it was for my asthma. He watched me deteriorate. He watched me cough blood. He watched me lose the ability to walk across a room without collapsing." She paused. "And he did it for money." She reached into the blanket wrapped around Hope and pulled out a small object. The teddy bear. Hand-stitched, brown corduroy, with a seam along the back that had been opened and re-sewn. She held it up so the congregation could see it. "Inside this bear is a cell phone," Rachel said. "On that phone are 43 hours of recorded conversations between Nathan Graves, Brianna Walsh, and Victor Salerno. Conversations about dosage. Conversations about timing. Conversations about how to make my death look like a pregnancy complication so that no one would ever order an autopsy." She set the bear on the lectern. "I recorded every word. Because I am a nurse. And nurses document everything." The silence broke. A woman in the 5th row began to cry. A man near the back stood up and walked toward the exit, shaking his head. Father Morrison closed his eyes and pressed his hands together. And in the last pew, Dominic Ferraro reached for his phone. Agent Marcus Holt appeared from behind the confessional booth on the east wall, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits. A second team entered through the main doors. A third emerged from the sacristy behind the altar. 9 federal agents in total, moving with the coordinated silence of people who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. Nathan Graves. Marcus Holt's voice was flat, professional, stripped of emotion. "Brianna Walsh, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Rachel Nguyen Graves, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and the illegal procurement and distribution of a controlled toxic substance. You have the right to remain silent." Nathan did not resist. He stood motionless as the agent turned him around and placed his wrists in handcuffs. His eyes still locked on Rachel. His mouth still open in that shapeless expression of collapse. Brianna resisted for exactly 2 seconds, a sharp twist of her shoulder, a hissed, "Don't touch me," before the agent behind her secured her wrists with a efficiency that suggested he had expected it. Dominic Ferraro was taken from the last pew without a word. His phone was seized. The screen showed an unsent message to a number registered under the name V.S. 2 letters that would, within 72 hours, lead Agent Holt's team to a rented condominium in Hendersonville, where Victor Salerno had been coordinating the operation remotely for 3 months. The casket stood empty on the altar. The white cloth stirred in the draft. Rachel turned to me. Hope had woken during the arrest, her small face scrunched against the noise and the light. But she was not crying. Rachel shifted her to the other arm and placed her free hand on my shoulder. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said. I looked at my granddaughter, 5 pounds, 11 ounces, 142 heartbeats per minute, alive, and I understood, with a clarity that 31 years on the federal bench had never given me, what justice actually looked like. It did not look like a gavel. It did not look like a sentence. It looked like a woman in a white blouse, standing in a church, holding a baby who was never supposed to survive, refusing to be silent. I placed my hand over Rachel's. "Let's take Hope home," I said. But as we turned to leave, Thomas intercepted us at the end of the aisle. His face was tight. "Walter," he said quietly, "Marcus just got word. Salerno isn't in Hendersonville. He's here, in Asheville. And he's been watching the church from across the street." The weight of something heavier settled over my shoulders. We were not finished. The rain had stopped by the time we stepped outside the basilica, but the sky remained the color of ash. Thomas walked 3 steps ahead of us, his phone pressed against his ear, his voice low and clipped. Rachel held Hope against her chest, the yellow blanket pulled up to shield the baby's face from the September air. I walked beside them, my hand resting on Rachel's elbow, not guiding her, but steadying myself. The adrenaline that had carried me through the indictment and the video and the arrest was draining now, replaced by something colder and heavier. Salerno was here. Not in a rented condominium 60 miles away. Not behind a phone screen coordinating through intermediaries. Here, in Asheville, watching. 2 black SUVs idled at the curb. Agent Holt had arranged them before the funeral contingency vehicles, he called them. Positioned for exactly this kind of development. Thomas opened the rear door of the first vehicle and motioned for Rachel to get inside. She paused, looked at me, and I nodded. She climbed in, adjusting Hope in her arms. I followed. Thomas took the front passenger seat. The driver was an agent. I had not met a woman in her early 30s with close-cropped hair and an expression that suggested she had driven through worse mornings than this one. Safe house on Marymount Avenue, Thomas said. Marcus is en route. The vehicle pulled away from the curb. I turned and looked through the tinted rear window at the Basilica of St. Lawrence, its copper dome shrinking against the gray sky. Nathan was somewhere inside, handcuffed, being processed. Brianna beside him, Ferraro in a separate vehicle. 3 dominoes fallen. But the hand that had set them in motion, the hand that had reached across 15 years of prison walls and probation records and old fury, was still free. We arrived at the safe house in 11 minutes. It was a 2-story brick colonial on a quiet residential street, unremarkable in every way. White shutters. A maple tree in the front yard beginning to turn amber at the edges. The kind of house you would drive past 1,000 times without noticing. That was the point. Agent Holt had secured it through the Bureau's witness protection logistics 3 days earlier, furnished with essentials. 2 bedrooms, a crib, medical supplies for Rachel, a secure landline, and a perimeter monitored by 4 agents in rotating 8-hour shifts. Rachel settled Hope in the crib upstairs. I stood in the kitchen, watching Thomas pace the length of the counter, his phone buzzing every 90 seconds with updates from Marcus Holt's team. Thomas set the phone down. Ferraro's phone has been processed. The unsent text to Salerno confirms a local number prepaid, purchased 3 weeks ago at a convenience store in West Asheville. GPS data from the phone tower puts that number within a 6-block radius of the Basilica as recently as 10:45 this morning. He paused. 15 minutes before the funeral started. He was watching everything, Walter. Marcus believes Salerno has been in Asheville for at least a week, maybe longer. The Hendersonville condo was a decoy leased under a shell company. Utilities active. Car parked in the driveway. Classic misdirection. Thomas rubbed the bridge of his nose. He wanted us to think he was remote. He wanted to be close enough to see it happen. I sat down at the kitchen table. The wood was cheap, laminated. Nothing like the mahogany in my study at Sunset Mountain, but the weight pressing down on my chest was the same weight I had felt in every capital case I had ever presided over, the awareness that a dangerous man was making decisions in real time, and that the margin between safety and catastrophe was measured in hours. What does Marcus need from us? I asked. Nothing. He needs you to stay here, stay quiet, and let his team work. They're pulling surveillance footage from every camera within a mile of the Basilica. Bolo issued statewide. Salerno's photograph has been distributed to every law enforcement agency in western North Carolina. Thomas sat down across from me. Walter, this is not your courtroom anymore. This is a federal manhunt. Let them do their job. He was right. I knew he was right. But sitting in that kitchen, listening to the muffled sound of Rachel singing to Hope upstairs, I could not silence the voice in my head, the same voice that had guided me through 31 years of decisions made under pressure. Salerno was not a man who watched from a distance without a plan. He had orchestrated Nathan's corruption, Brianna's insertion into our lives, the procurement of Paraquat from Juarez, the insurance policy, and the timeline of Rachel's death with the patience of someone who had spent 12 years in a cell refining every detail. He was not in Asheville to observe. He was in Asheville to finish something. My phone buzzed at 7:14 that evening. Nathan's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Dad. His voice was hoarse, stripped of every layer of performance I had heard at the funeral. He was calling from the Buncombe County Detention Center. Dad, please. You have to listen to me. You have 30 seconds, I said. Salerno, he made me do this. All of it. The pills, the policy. Brianna, I didn't have a choice. He found me 2 years ago in Atlantic City. I owed people money, bad money. And he offered to clear the debt if I did what he asked. He said he'd kill me if I didn't. He said he'd kill you. Nathan's breathing was ragged. I know what I did. I know. But I didn't want to. You had a choice, I said. You had a choice every single morning when you handed that pill to your wife. You had a choice when you looked at her losing weight and coughing blood and gasping for breath. And you chose to watch. $212,000 in gambling debt does not erase the fact that you tried to murder the mother of your child. I hung up. My hands were shaking. Not from anger. The anger had burned through me hours ago and left only embers. They were shaking from grief. The kind of grief that has no casket, no funeral, no eulogy. The grief of a father who has lost his son not to death, but to something worse. To the slow, voluntary erosion of every principle, every value, every lesson that I had spent 41 years trying to teach him. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had changed into a gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, her feet bare against the tile floor. She did not ask who had called. She could see it on my face. She crossed the room, pulled out the chair beside me, and sat down. She placed her hand on my forearm. Neither of us spoke. The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere upstairs, Hope made a small sound in her sleep. Not a cry, but a murmur. The kind of sound that newborns make when they are dreaming about something they cannot yet name. After a long time, Rachel said, "Let's go home, Walter. When this is over, let's take Hope home." I covered her hand with mine. "We will," I said. "I promise." They found Victor Salerno on September 9th, 5 days after the funeral, in a rented room above a barbershop on Patton Avenue. Agent Holt's team had traced the prepaid phone to a series of transactions at 3 locations in West Asheville: a laundromat, a gas station, and a Vietnamese grocery store where Salerno had been purchasing food in cash every 2 days. Surveillance footage from the grocery's parking lot captured him on the afternoon of September 6th, 71 years old, thinner than the man I had sentenced 15 years ago, his silver hair cropped short, wearing a canvas jacket and reading glasses. He looked like a retired professor. He looked like someone's grandfather. He was. The arrest was quiet. No standoff. No gunfire. 2 agents entered through the front of the barbershop at 6:20 in the morning, while a third covered the fire escape. Salerno was sitting at a small desk by the window, drinking black coffee and reading a newspaper, the Asheville Citizen-Times, which had run a front-page story about the funeral arrests 2 days earlier. He did not resist. He set the coffee down, placed his hands on the desk, and said one sentence to the agent who handcuffed him. "Tell Judge Graves he should have given me life when he had the chance." Thomas called me with the news at 7:15. I was standing on the porch of the safe house, watching the maple tree shed its first amber leaves onto the lawn. Rachel was inside, feeding Hope. The morning was cool, the sky finally clear after days of overcast gray. I listened to Thomas relay the details, thanked him, and hung up. Then I sat down on the porch steps and stayed there for a long time, feeling the weight of 3 months slowly begin to lift from my shoulders, vertebra by vertebra, like a sentence being commuted 1 year at a time. The trial began on January 14th of the following year. The United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina. The same courthouse where I had served for 3 decades. The same hallway I had walked every morning for 31 years. The same oak doors, the same marble floors, the same brass plaque that read, equal justice under law. I had entered that building 10,000 times as a judge. On January 14th, I entered as a witness. The case was prosecuted by Jennifer Park, an assistant United States attorney whom I had watched argue cases in my courtroom years earlier. She was meticulous, relentless, and possessed a gift for narrative that most trial lawyers spend entire careers trying to develop. She understood that juries do not convict based on evidence alone. They convict based on the story the evidence tells. And the story she told was devastating. The trial lasted 11 days. Jennifer presented 147 exhibits, the paraquat lab analysis from Dr. Martin Aldridge, the $3.2 million insurance policy, 8 months of email correspondence between Nathan and Salerno, retrieved from Nathan's laptop and corroborated by server records subpoenaed from 3 separate providers. The hidden camera footage from my study, Rachel's 43 hours of audio from the teddy bear phone, financial records showing 17 wire transfers totaling $48,600 from Brianna Walsh's account to a pharmaceutical intermediary in Juarez, Mexico, Nathan's browser history, 112 searches related to paraquat toxicity, symptom timelines, cremation procedures, and insurance claim requirements, and Dominic Ferraro's seized phone containing 231 text messages exchanged with Salerno over a period of 4 months. I testified on the 3rd day. I sat in the witness chair, the same chair I had watched thousands of witnesses occupy from the other side, and answered Jennifer Park's questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I described the night Nathan arrived at my door, the morning I found the unmarked pill, the phone call I overheard at 2 a.m., the moment Dr. Aldridge confirmed the substance was paraquat, the hidden camera, the evidence gathering, the plan. I spoke clearly and without emotion, the way I had trained myself to speak for 3 decades, because I understood that the most powerful testimony is the kind that does not need to raise its voice. Rachel testified on the 5th day. She wore a navy blazer and spoke for 3 hours. She described the pills, the escalating symptoms, the moment she began to suspect, the night she sewed the phone into the teddy bear, the 43 hours of recording she had made while pretending to be too weak to notice what was happening around her. When Jennifer asked her why she had not gone to the police immediately, Rachel answered without hesitation, "Because I needed enough evidence to make sure he could never do this to anyone else. I am a nurse. I have watched patients die because someone missed a symptom, overlooked a warning sign, failed to document. I was not going to let that happen to my daughter." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On January 28th, they returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Nathan Graves. Guilty of attempted murder in the 1st degree. Conspiracy to commit murder. Insurance fraud. And procurement of a toxic substance with intent to cause bodily harm. Sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Brianna Walsh. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to attempted murder, insurance fraud, and money laundering. Sentenced to 18 years. Victor Salerno. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, witness intimidation, and orchestrating a criminal enterprise from within and after federal incarceration. Sentenced to 25 years. To be served consecutively with the remaining 3 years of his original sentence. He would die in prison. He knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. Dominic Ferraro. Guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and acting as an accessory. Sentenced to 8 years. I sat in the gallery when the sentences were read. 3rd row, left side. The same position I had occupied at the funeral. Rachel sat beside me, her hand on mine. Hope was with Dr. Castillo at the safe house, too young for courtrooms, too important to risk. Thomas sat behind us, his briefcase on the floor between his feet, his expression unreadable. When the judge, the Honorable Catherine Woodard, a colleague I had known for 20 years, read Nathan's sentence, I watched my son's face. He stood at the defense table, his wrists unshackled for the proceedings, his suit wrinkled, his posture diminished. He did not look at me. He stared at the table's surface as the number 40 left the judge's mouth and settled over the courtroom like a stone dropping into deep water. His daughter would be 40 before he breathed free air again. If he lived that long. I searched myself for satisfaction and found none. I searched for relief and found only a thin, fragile version of it, the kind that dissolves if you hold it too tightly. What I found instead, buried beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the 3 months of accumulated fear, was something I did not expect. Clarity. The understanding that justice is not a feeling. It is a structure. It does not repair what was broken. It does not restore what was taken. It simply draws a line and says, "No further." Rachel squeezed my hand as we stood to leave. "It's over," she said. I looked at her, this woman who had entered my life, soaked and pregnant and terrified on a Thursday night in June, who had survived a poison designed to kill her slowly, who had built her own case from inside the room where she was being murdered, and I shook my head. "No," I said. "It's beginning." Rachel filed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months after the trial ended. I remember the date because Hope took her first steps that same week, 3 unsteady strides across the living room floor before she grabbed the edge of Dorothy's reading chair and looked up at me with an expression of pure astonishment, as though she had just discovered that the world was larger than she had previously estimated. She was 18 months old. She had her mother's dark hair and her grandmother's eyes. Dorothy's eyes, brown and wide and full of a curiosity that no amount of suffering had managed to extinguish in the women of this family. We had returned to the house on Sunset Mountain in late February, after 5 months at the safe house on Marymount Avenue. Rachel had wanted to wait. Not to heal, her lungs had recovered to 87% capacity by December. A number doctor, Castillo called remarkable, but to decide whether she could live in a house where she had been slowly poisoned. She walked through every room the day we visited, pausing in the guest bedroom where Nathan had handed her the white pill each morning, pausing in the kitchen where she had first coughed blood, pausing at the bathroom door where I had found her collapsed on the tile. She stood in each space and breathed. Then she turned to me and said, "The house didn't hurt me, Walter." He did. And he's gone. We moved back the following week. The Breathe Again Foundation was registered as a 501(c)(3) nonprofit in the state of North Carolina on March 11th. Rachel served as executive director. Dr. Linda Castillo joined the medical advisory board. Thomas Pritchard handled the legal incorporation pro bono, and his wife Helen designed the intake and referral process. Jennifer Park agreed to serve on the board of directors. Agent Marcus Holt connected Rachel with the FBI's domestic violence unit, which provided training materials and a direct referral line for cases involving chemical abuse within intimate partnerships. The mission was specific: identify, support, and protect victims of covert poisoning within domestic relationships. Rachel understood, better than anyone, how invisible this form of abuse could be. A pill dissolved in coffee, a powder mixed into a smoothie, a substance added to medication that a trusting partner swallows without question day after day, while their body deteriorates and their doctors run tests that reveal nothing because no one thinks to test for what no one suspects. She had lived inside that invisibility. She had survived, not because the system caught it, but because she had caught it herself. With a cell phone sewn into a teddy bear and the instincts of a nurse who refused to stop documenting. The foundation operated from a small office on Charlotte Street in downtown Asheville, 3 rooms above a bookstore. Within the first year, Breathe Again received over 300 inquiries. 47 were classified as active cases. 14 resulted in criminal referrals to law enforcement. 9 led to arrests. 9 families whose stories might have ended differently. In September, 1 year after the funeral at the Basilica of St. Lawrence, Rachel accepted an invitation to speak at a domestic violence awareness conference in Charlotte. I drove her there. Hope sat in her car seat in the back, chewing on a stuffed elephant and babbling at the window. Rachel was quiet for most of the drive, reviewing her notes on a legal pad, crossing out sentences and rewriting them in the margins. "You don't need notes," I told her, as we crossed the Catawba River. "You lived it." She looked at me and smiled. Not the brave smile, not the polite smile, but the real one, the one I had first seen in the cabin on the morning Hope was born. "I know," she said, "but I want to get it right. For the women who are still living it." She spoke for 42 minutes. I sat in the back of the conference hall with Hope on my lap and listened to my daughter-in-law tell 300 people how she had been poisoned by her husband, how she had documented her own attempted murder, and how she had walked into her own funeral, carrying the daughter who was never supposed to survive. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the clarity of someone who understands that the truth, stated plainly, is more powerful than any performance. The audience stood when she finished. Hope clapped her hands because everyone else was clapping, and the sound of her small palms meeting together was, for me, the loudest thing in the room. Afterward, in the parking lot, Rachel buckled Hope into the car seat and turned to me. "I have one more thing to do," she said. "I want to go back to school, finish my law degree. I want to represent women like me, not just support them, not just refer them, but stand in a courtroom and fight for them." She paused. "The way you fought for me?" I thought of Dorothy, who had once told me that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you set in motion. I thought of Hope, already walking, already reaching for things beyond her grasp. And I thought of the guest bedroom upstairs where a man had once handed a woman a pill designed to kill her, and where that same woman now read bedtime stories to her daughter every night, in a voice that grew stronger with each passing week. "I think," I said, "that Dorothy would have loved you very much." Rachel's eyes glistened. She placed her hand against my cheek, a gesture so tender, so unhesitating, that it bridged every silence between us, and nodded. We drove home as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in copper and violet. Hope fell asleep before we reached the highway. Rachel rested her head against the window, and I drove, both hands on the wheel, watching the road unspool before me like a sentence that had finally found its way to the right ending. But there was still one more thing I needed to do. I wrote the will on a Saturday evening in August. 2 years after the funeral, the house was quiet. Rachel had taken Hope to the farmer's market on North Lexington Avenue that morning, and they had returned with a basket of peaches and a small sunflower that Hope insisted on planting in the backyard garden, Dorothy's garden, the one she had built 30 years ago with river stones and climbing roses and a wooden bench that I had never once sat on without thinking of her. I watched from the kitchen window as Rachel knelt beside Hope in the dirt, guiding her small hands around the base of the sunflower, pressing the soil down with patient, deliberate care. Hope was 2 years old. She spoke in full sentences now, her vocabulary expanding each week, like a vine reaching for light. Her favorite word was again. Read it again. Sing it again. Tell me again. She did not yet understand that some things cannot be repeated, that some moments exist only once and must be held carefully. The way you hold water in cupped hands, knowing it will slip through eventually. I turned from the window and walked to my study. The room had changed since Nathan's arrest. I had removed the desk, where the hidden camera had captured his confession. I had replaced it with a smaller writing table walnut, simple, purchased from a furniture maker in Black Mountain, and positioned it beneath the window that overlooked the eastern ridge. Dorothy's photograph hung on the wall above, taken on our honeymoon in Savannah in 1981. She was 25 in the picture, laughing. Her hair caught in the wind, her hand reaching toward the camera as though trying to pull me into the frame. I had looked at that photograph 10,000 times. It never aged. She never aged. Only I did. I sat down, opened the leather folder Thomas had prepared, and began to read. The will was straightforward. Thomas had drafted it according to my instructions, and I had reviewed it twice already. But tonight I wanted to read it one final time, not as a legal document, but as a letter to the people I would leave behind. The house on Sunset Mountain, including all furnishings, the garden, and the surrounding 2.4 acres, was to be transferred to Rachel Nguyen Graves upon my death. No conditions, no trusts, no complications. The house had been in my name for 36 years. Dorothy and I had raised Nathan in these rooms, had watched him take his first steps on these floors, had argued and reconciled and grown old within these walls. The house had witnessed our best years and our worst. It had held Dorothy's decline and my grief and Nathan's betrayal and Rachel's suffering and Hope's birth and the slow, improbable reconstruction of a family from the wreckage of the one that came before. It deserved to belong to someone who understood what it had survived. My retirement accounts, totaling approximately $1.4 million, were to be divided into two portions. 60% was designated for a trust fund in Hope Dorothy Graves's name, accessible when she turned 25, old enough, I hoped, to understand the weight of money and the responsibility it carries. The remaining 40% was allocated to the Breathe Again Foundation as an endowment, structured to generate operational funding for a minimum of 15 years. Thomas had calculated the projections. Rachel had reviewed them. The numbers were sound. A separate provision established a scholarship fund, the Dorothy Graves Memorial Scholarship, to be administered through the University of North Carolina at Asheville, providing full tuition for one student per year, pursuing a degree in nursing or social work. Dorothy had been a school teacher for 28 years before the Alzheimer's diagnosis. She had believed, with a conviction that bordered on stubbornness, that education was the only inheritance worth leaving. I had disagreed with her on many things over 43 years of marriage. On this, she had been right. I set down the document and picked up a separate sheet of paper. Blank, unlined, cream-colored. The same stock I had used for the indictment I read at the Basilica. But this was not an indictment. This was something I had been composing in my head for months, waiting for the right evening to commit it to ink. You are 2 years old as I write this, and you are outside planting a sunflower with your mother. You do not know what happened before you were born. You do not know about the pills or the poison, or the man who gave them to your mother each morning while she carried you inside her. One day you will learn. One day someone will tell you, or you will read about it, or you will find this letter and the documents that accompany it, and you will understand why your grandfather spent the last years of his life the way he did. I want you to know 3 things. First, your mother is the bravest person I have ever known. Braver than any defendant I sentenced. Braver than any attorney who argued before me. Braver than me. She survived not because someone rescued her, but because she refused to stop fighting for herself and for you. When you are old enough to understand courage, look at her. She is the definition. Second, your grandmother Dorothy would have adored you. She would have read to you every night. She would have taught you to plant roses and bake cornbread and argue with grace. She is gone, but she is not absent. She lives in this house, in this garden, in the chair where your mother reads to you, in the middle name you carry. Dorothy. Remember it. Third, love is not a feeling. Love is a decision made every morning, in every room, with every breath. It is the decision to protect, the decision to stay, the decision to tell the truth when the truth is dangerous. I made that decision on the night your mother arrived at my door, and I have made it every day since. You are my legacy, Hope. Not the verdicts, not the sentences, not the house, or the money, or the reputation. You, a 5-pound 11-ounce girl with your grandmother's eyes who grabbed my finger on the day she was born and never let go. I folded the letter, placed it inside the leather folder beside the will, and closed it. Then I sat in the study for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house, Rachel's footsteps on the porch, Hope's laughter drifting through the screen door, the creak of the floorboards that had creaked for 36 years and would creak for 36 more. The house was breathing. It had always been breathing. I had simply forgotten how to listen. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and opened the back door. Rachel looked up from the garden, her knees dirty, her hair tied back. Hope balanced on her hip. The sunflower stood upright in the soil, small and defiant, leaning slightly toward the last of the evening light. "Grandpa," Hope called, reaching both arms toward me. "Come see. Come see again." I stepped into the garden. Christmas morning arrived the way it always does on Sunset Mountain. Slowly, quietly, as though the world itself understood that some moments deserve a gentler entrance. I woke before dawn. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the string of white bulbs Rachel had woven through the banister the week before. I lay in bed, listening. The furnace hummed. A branch scraped against the window. Somewhere down the hall, Hope murmured in her sleep that soft, wordless sound she made when she was dreaming. The sound that had become, over the past 2 years, the first thing I listened for each morning and the last thing I listened for each night. I rose, put on my robe, and walked to the kitchen. Snow had fallen overnight. Not much an inch. Maybe 2, but enough to cover Dorothy's garden in a thin white sheet that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light. The sunflower Hope had planted in August was gone, claimed by the first frost in October. But Rachel had marked the spot with a small stone, and Hope had painted it yellow with a brush too large for her hand. The stone sat in the center of the garden like a period at the end of a sentence, small and final, and exactly where it belonged. I made coffee in Dorothy's French press, carried it to the library, and sat in my chair across from hers. The bookshelves lined 3 walls. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments spanning 40 years. A glass cardinal Dorothy had found at a craft fair in Weaverville, a wooden gavel Rachel had carved for me as a joke, and a handprint ornament Hope had made at daycare, her fingers preserved in red and green paint on a circle of white clay. I looked at Dorothy's empty chair. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I said. The house did not answer, but it held the words the way old houses hold everything in the walls, in the floors, in the spaces between sounds, where memory lives longer than the people who made it. At 7:15, I heard footsteps. Small, rapid, uneven, the particular rhythm of a 2-year-old who has not yet learned that running and walking are different activities. Hope appeared in the doorway wearing red pajamas printed with snowflakes, her dark hair wild from sleep, her grandmother's eyes wide with the intensity of a child who knows something extraordinary happens on this particular morning. "Grandpa!" She ran to me. I caught her, lifted her onto my lap, and felt her arms wrap around my neck with a strength that seemed impossible for someone who weighed 26 pounds. "Presents?" she whispered, as though the word itself was sacred. "Soon. Let's wait for Mama." Rachel appeared a minute later, carrying 2 mugs of tea and a small wrapped box. She kissed the top of Hope's head and sat down in Dorothy's chair. She fit there. She had always fit there. Not as a replacement, no one replaces anyone, but as a continuation. The way a river continues past a bend. The way a story continues past the chapter you thought was the last one. "Open it," Rachel said, handing me the box. Inside was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. 3 people standing in Dorothy's garden on an autumn afternoon. Rachel, Hope, and me. Hope was on my hip, pointing at something off camera. Rachel stood beside us, her hand on my shoulder, her face tilted toward the sun. On the back of the frame, in Rachel's handwriting, were 5 words, "The family Dorothy prayed for." I held the frame until the image blurred. I was 74 years old. I had spent 31 years delivering justice from a federal bench. I had watched my wife disappear into a disease that erased her one memory at a time. I had watched my son choose money over his wife's life. I had stood in a church and played a video that sent him to prison for 40 years. And I had held my granddaughter on the morning she was born, 5 pounds, 11 ounces, 142 heartbeats per minute, and promised her that no one would ever hurt her again. God gives you one life. He does not tell you how it will unfold. He does not promise that the people you love will make the choices you taught them to make. But he gives you the capacity if you are willing, if you are brave, if you refuse to look away to build again, to open a door on a rainy night, to catch a pill before it kills, to stand up in a church and tell the truth. God gave me Rachel. God gave me hope. And in return, I gave them the only thing that outlasts all of it. Hope climbed down from my lap, pulled a picture book from the lowest shelf, and brought it back to me with both hands extended. "Read it again, Grandpa," she said. I opened the book. Rachel tucked her feet beneath her in Dorothy's chair and wrapped her hands around her mug. The white lights on the banister glowed through the doorway. The house creaked in the wind, the same creak it had made for 36 years. The same sound Dorothy had once called the house breathing. I looked at my granddaughter. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the space beside Rachel's chair, where Dorothy's presence still lingered like perfume in a room long after someone has left. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that love is worth fighting for and truth is worth telling, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere right now, there is a woman swallowing a pill she does not understand, given to her by someone she trusts. She deserves to know she is not alone.